Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and today I'm going to take you through some of the history of Canadian politics and contrast that with how Indigenous nations approach their politics. The book that I'm quoting from is from 1916, and it's called The Winning of Popular Government, and it chronicles the union of the two provinces in 1841. So it's around mid-1800s. What's important about this is illustrating how Canada's politics developed. And essentially it's the absolute opposite of how Indigenous nations conduct their politics, or at least used to. Essentially the difference is a very dictator top-down approach to force Canada into something, the Canadian politics to progress a certain way, whereas on the Indigenous side, to my knowledge, in my experience and exposure to the old ways, if you will, very much a decision in the power of the people and key structures that ensure a consensus building, input into the circle by however many are necessary, and taking the time that's needed in order to come to a good outcome. That is not the same that has happened in Canada. So again, remember this is 1916. To the young, politics seems rather a stupid sort of game played by the bald and obese middle-aged for very high stakes and governed by no rules that any player is bound to respect. Between the rival teams, no difference is observable, save that one enjoys the sweets of office and the mouth of the other is watering for them. And as they were trying to deal with a crisis of governance in this part of the world, the significance of these and other similar incidents can only be understood by recalling the mental attitude of Americans of the day. They had a robust detestation of everything British. It is not grossly exaggerated by Dickens in such and such. And that attitude was entirely natural. The Americans had, or thought they had, beaten the British in 2 wars. The very reason for the existence of their nation was the opposition to British tyranny. They saw that tyranny in all its balefulness blighting the 2 Canadas, because there were 2 separate colonies. They saw those oppressed colonies rising as they themselves had risen against their oppressors. To make the danger all the more acute, the exiled Canadians, notably William Lionel Mackenzie, went from place to place in the United States, inciting the freeborn citizens of the Republic to aid the cause of freedom across the line. There was precedent for intervention. Basically what then arose is this huge conspiracy of the, quote, hunters' lodges all along the northern border of the United States. And Lord Durham took prompt action. He offered a reward of £1,000 for such information as should bring the guilty persons to trial in an American, not a Canadian court. Thereby he said in effect, this is not an international affair, it is a plain offense against the laws of the United States, and I am confident that the United States desires to prevent such outrages. He followed up with this bold declaration of faith in American justice to protect Canada from the efforts to give the Canadian colonies the freedom that the United States had done for itself. Followed this up by sending his brother-in-law, Colonel Gray of the 71st Regiment, to Washington to lay the facts before President Van Buren and to remonstrate vigorously against the laxity which permitted an armed force to organize within the borders of the Republic for an attack upon its peaceful neighbor, being Canada, the colonies. Such laxity was against the law of nations. Now look at the irony, as Canada has been so quick to present armed forces within the borders of Indigenous nations, contrary to the law of nations, and contrary, of course, to the treaties. And the President of the United States at that point actually followed the advice and took those steps to put down those hunters' lodges. Now, Lord Durham provided quite a legacy to Canada. It defined once for, did a big report on what were the issues taking place. And he defined once and for all the principles that should govern the relations of the colony with the mother country and laid the foundations of the present Canadian unity. The people themselves did not create the unity. It was dictated to through the report of Lord Durham, who had been appointed by the Crown. It did not please the factions in Canada. It was too plain spoken. Exception may be taken even at the present day to some of its recommendations and conclusions. But its faithful pictures of this hitherto turbulent colony enable the historic student and the honest patriot to measure the progress the country has since made on the road to nationhood. On the road to nationhood, not a nation. If unpleasant, it is very easy reading. So again, colonies couldn't get along. No one knew what to do. Queen appoints Lord Durham. He reports and says, this is how you're going to do it. This is what you must do. The essential thing was to obtain the consent of the governed generally, but they were turbulent, torn by factions, and hard to bring to reason. This is why you had proposals not coming from the people, but imposed on the people. And now this is Paulette Thompson, who is speaking about the politics of the time. He says his general view of the political conditions is shown in a private letter to his chief, Lord John Russell. The picture he draws is lively, unflattering, but instructive. I am satisfied that the mass of the people are sound, moderate in their demands, and attached to British institutions, but they have been oppressed by a miserable little oligarchy on the one hand, and excited by a few factious demagogues on the other. I can make a middle reforming party, I am sure, that will put down both. Not resolving, not peacemaking, although ironically he's called a peacemaker, but to put down these turbulent, troublesome groupings. The record of 75 years and of 2 wars shows the attachment of the Canadians to British institutions and how justly the Governor-General appraised the mass of the people. Not less clearly did he judge the politicians of the day, their pettiness, their naive selfishness, their disregard of rule and form, shocking all the instincts of the British man of business and the trained parliamentary hand. You can form no idea, he continues, of the way a colonial parliament transacts its business. I got them into comparative order and decency by having measures brought forward by the government and well and steadily worked through. But when it came to their own affairs, and above all to money matters, there was a scene of confusion and riot of which no one in England can have any idea. Every man proposes a vote for his own job, and bills are introduced without notice and carried through all their stages in a quarter of an hour. One of the greatest advantages of the Union will be that it will be possible to introduce a new system of legislating and, above all, a restriction upon the initiation of money votes. Without the last, I would not give a farthing for my bill, and the change would be decidedly popular. For the members all complain that under the present system, they cannot refuse to move a job for any constituent who desires it. The wheels of government had been definitely blocked by racial hatred. The Constitution was still suspended. There's positively no machinery of government. Thomas wrote in a private letter, everything is to be done by the governor and his secretary. There were no heads of departments accessible, and in Thompson's opinion, paving the way for the Union, he was under no illusions as to his methods. Nothing but a despotism could have got them through. A House of Assembly, whether single or double, would have spent 10 years at them, he claims with perfect truth. Again, not resolved by the people, forced upon them, dictated to, and fully intentionally. The country was to be divided into small self-governing units, municipalities, taxing themselves for their own necessary expenditures and controlling the revenues so raised. That's the core of Canadian government. The elections of 1841 were held with the bad old-fashioned accompaniments of riot and bloodshed. especially in the centers of Montreal and Toronto. Neither side was free from the blame of irregular methods. Certainly, the government was not scrupulous in the means it employed to secure the return of Union candidates. In spite of ignorance and errors and worse, the parliamentarians had really learned the lessons of procedure which were forced on them, which he had so deftly taught, and they now settled down to the regular game of ins and outs, according to established and accepted rules. The irreconcilables were gradually tamed as wild animals are, by hunger first, and then by being fed with sufficient quantities of the loaves and fishes. Power, office, good permanent positions, fat salaries proved strong sedatives of yeasty aspirations toward vague political ideals. There were still to be grave difficulties, crises, reactions towards the old order of things, but the cardinal principle of popular government was finally accepted, and ever since 1841 has been in continuous operation as part and parcel of the Constitution. There was a crying need for intervention by a true statesman from without who, with his eyes unblinded by local prejudices and passions, could take his stand above all parties and in benevolent despotism lead them into concerted action for their own good and the good of the country. Sometimes Canadians are inclined to write the tale of the building of the nation as if that splendid fabric were all the work of their own hands, as if our own arm had brought salvation onto us. This is manifest fallacy. Without a dirham to diagnose the malady and a Sydenham, these are governors, to apply the remedy, the condition of the body politic must have been past cure. So this also helps explain why Pierre Elliott Trudeau, when he was Prime Minister, thought it fine to proceed unilaterally to add to the Constitution of Canada in the ways that he did. It's how things have been done. People in Canada are told this is how it's going to be done. And of course, this is the experience that Indigenous nations are dealing with. Indian bands being told this is how you do things. I was shocked when I was first seeing meetings in elections and things to see 50-year-old women in fisticuffs fighting. The kind of turmoil and everything that's described here is very much in play and in happening on reserves today. But if you look at when the governance was according to and uninterfered with, it was according to Indigenous law, none of this kind of stuff was happening. You earned your role as a leader in quite different ways. They were not dictated to, the people were not controlled. The people were part of forming and adapting and proceeding and existing for thousands of years. And so here's another example. Election was rarely held without an election roll. It seems impossible that it is, of Canada, one reads, a number of shanty men having no votes were hired by Mr. Baldwin's party to create a disturbance. They did so and ill-treated Mr. Murney's supporters. The latter, however, rallied and drove their dastardly assailants from the field. 2 companies of the 23rd Regiment were sent from Kingston to keep the peace, and polling was most unjustly discontinued for 1 day. Free fights between bands of rival voters armed with clubs, swords, and firearms, injuries from which men were not expected to recover, order restored by the intervention of the military. These were no unusual incidents in an old-time Canadian election. Again, getting back to municipalities, another wise measure for which Baldwin deserves no little praise is the Municipal Corporations Act. The title has a dry legal look and will suggest little or nothing to the general reader, except possibly red tape. Moreover, the system by which the subdivisions of the country, the county, the township, the incorporated village, govern themselves seems so obvious and works so smoothly in actual practice that it seems part of the order of nature, and must have existed from the time beyond which the memory of man runneth not to the contrary. But the present extended system of home rule in Canada did not descend from heaven complete like the 12 tables. It was a gradual growth or evolution from the old system by which the local justices of the peace, sitting in quarter sessions, assessed the local taxes, with the difference that it was not an unconscious growth. Contrast that with the continuing connection of Indigenous laws and governance to the Creator, and the reference as Creator-given gifts, and exercised in respect and conscious of Creator. So this unity, the two provinces being forced together, says there was, and this had come to be, but even then things weren't solved. This is talking 12 years after that. There was a violent strife between two parties, too evenly balanced. The remedy lay in the formation of a larger unity. And in 1867, the four provinces effected a confederation, which was soon to embrace half the continent from ocean to ocean. So the efforts to obtain good governance, if you will, the Union didn't achieve that, despite the benevolent dictators and despots that imposed their will. And so the response was, well, let's just add in some others so that we're not so evenly balanced, and maybe that will work. In those old days, there were no Canadians of Canada. Confederation had to be achieved, a new generation had to be born and grow to manhood before a national settlement was possible. These new Canadians saw little or nothing of provinces with outworn feuds and divisions. They saw only the Dominion of Canada. Their imagination was stirred by the ideal of half a continent staked out for a second great experiment in democracy, of a vast domain to be filled and subdued and raised to power by a new nation. By the same token, we have the same efforts of assimilation. We have the same political strategies that I've outlined in many episodes being enforced and pushed forward, and there's nothing resolved. All that's happening is a deferral of liabilities, is a building of intensity. It's consistent with what was experienced in Canada's past. And by the same token, it's going to take a new generation that knows what the treaties really mean in law, not what they're said to mean. In a new generation that will no longer be satisfied with a big lie and proceeding on the basis that the only quote-unquote practical solution to the quote-unquote Indian problem is for full-scale assimilation, the destruction of nations, the destruction of treaties, the destruction of the very foundation that Indigenous nationals are very quick to say, look, you know what, it wasn't just the two parties, the Crown and us nations, but also the Creator. And those words that are so often quoted, these will exist for so long as the waters flow, the grass grows, the sun shines, in whatever order. It's important for Canadians to also understand that that could well be a bit of a prophecy, that if these treaties fall, what happens to Canada as a whole and to the people that call this part of the world home. And that's all I have to say.